Otsio, Ulanuhi Nuato Hiadu. Chi Zalagi, Chi Anawodi, Chino Tonane, Nancy Gillis Dagwadoa. I have introduced myself and greeted you in the language I heard growing up at home. And Joe, I think I'm getting a little feedback. Is there? Okay, he'll work on it. First, I called on the Creator to be present so that everything said and done here is done in a good manner. Then I told you what tribe I belong to, then what clan I belong to, and only then did I give you my name, because for traditional Native people, that is the correct order of things. I am Cherokee and Choctaw and Scots-Irish and French, and it's the Scots-Irish and French that makes me look the way I do. I did have black hair, so I was raised very traditional Cherokee. The language was still spoken at home, and all of the ceremonies were kept. I've been in Nebraska since 1987, came to work with the Winnebago tribe, and have been here ever since. So with my program today, now some of you, I know I have some acquaintances in the audience and have been to some of my other programs, and I'm a historian and a cultural anthropologist by training. So I had, at the Neihardt Center, I was director there for almost 20 years in Bancroft. How many have been to the Neihardt Center in Bancroft? All right, more of you need to go. It's a gem of a state historic site, and also there on exhibit are the artifacts belonging to Dr. Susan LaFlèche Picot, first Native American doctor, who was Omaha from Macy, and that her hospital in Walt Hill. I'm on the board of that organization that is restoring the hospital. It's a national landmark, and if you want to see her belongings, her medical paraphernalia, and something on her life, go back down to the Neihardt Center. So the program today has to do with a little-known piece of history. Now, of course, prior to excuse me, European contact, extensive trade between the tribes was already long in place, and the ensuing 4 centuries is well documented. However, as nearly all 17th through 20th century historians were white males and not inclined to record the contributions of Native women, to fully grasp the fur trade without their role is only superficial. And as I hope to make abundantly clear, women occupied a unique and thoroughly vital position. Now, the earliest European traders, colonization was not the focus, so they brought very few of their own women, and that made it difficult to maintain their cultures. Instead, they quickly adopted the cultures around them because their new livelihoods and their very lives depended on coping with a completely alien environment. And they found relationships between the sexes here much different than they were accustomed to in Europe or back east. It was relationships more of fully equal partners. And that was split between the men in hunting and protection and the women in procuring and producing goods of all kinds. Traditionally, men traded infrequently, and usually for weapons and ceremonial items. Trappers and traders purchased nearly all foodstuffs and clothing from Native women, because it was the Native women who finished the hides for lodges, made clothing, moccasins, snowshoes, trapped rabbit and mink, made the canoes, tended gardens, gathered medicinals and foodstuffs. such as camas root, wild rice, maple sugar, berries, and they produced and distributed these items as the principal traders between tribes and with the new European traders. Now, both Joseph Whitehouse, a skin dresser and tailor who traveled with Lewis and Clark and was at Fort Mandan in 1804, and Manuel Lisa in 1807 noted in their writings about women arriving with corn, beans, squash, dried meat, and fish to trade along with the hides for steel needles, awls, cooking pots. And they also brought with them ornamented goods that used beads, bells, buttons, ribbons, and paint on elaborately decorated shirts, leggings, moccasins, rifle cases, horse trappings, and so forth. Because the decorated items brought higher prices at the forts, and that increased her economic position. Now, about those dressed skins, tanning a buffalo robe was a 3-day job, and they often tanned up to 35 in a winter season. And these were of far more value than raw pelts. Now, even with the emphasis placed in literature and film, there was a relatively small role for alcohol in the trade. In 1740, Fort Albany records 494 gallons of liquor, valued at 1,976 finished pelts. Yet more than twice that amount was spent on tobacco, 5 times on firearms, 2 times on cloth, and even more on blankets and kettles. Now, though a common item of trade, it was by no means a dominant one. And this amount, if you're into statistics, this amount would have allowed for no more than approximately 10 2-ounce drinks per year per person for the population of the time. So the trade was not rampant in alcohol. Captain Henry of the Ashley and Henry expeditions mentions how at one Ojibwa village the men asked for alcohol in exchange for furs, but the women demanded a wide variety of goods in exchange for rice and hides and other things. The Hudson's Bay Company recognized that the free flow of alcohol would cause problems. George Simpson, who was governor of the Hudson Bay Company, ended the trade of alcohol for furs in 1822. Now, many accounts do depict natives increasingly violent due to alcohol use, but they failed to recognize other explanations, such as dwindling male autonomy, increasingly scarce resources, encroachment on lands, and a new focus on individual wealth accumulation, which was an antithesis to the culture. Trader Michel Quillot, in his 1804 journal, relates the vast majority of his trade among the Odawa was with the women. He recorded 64 separate direct transactions, only 19 were with men. One in particular was Ninoqua, who presented 10 fine beaver skins. And she had with her a white captive by the name of John Tanner, who had been kidnapped in Kentucky by 2 Ojibwa men and carried north into Michigan Territory. When he was 11 years old, he was sold to Ninoqua, who adopted him, and he lived with her from 1790 to 1820, gaining valuable skills as a liaison, as an interpreter. And he wrote of his adopted mother that she was, quote, regarded as a principal chief of the Odawa, and whenever she arrived at Mackinac to trade, she was saluted by a gun. A side note, in 1800, when John Tanner was 20, he will marry an Ojibwa woman, Mishquabunaquah, the niece of Michigan fur trader Magdalene de Frambois, and I'll talk about her a little bit later. Now, notice something unusual. I've given you their names. Most of these women appear in the records and journals under their own names, something we often don't see even in Anglo history of this time period. Women traditionally controlled mediums of exchange between the other tribes, which continued as forts and posts increased. Now, nothing reported resembles the image of a shy woman relying on the men to trade for them. Prince Maximilian noted, when the Blackfoot women thought their husbands might trade buffalo robes for alcohol, would tan the hides partially and poorly, so they had less value. James Strange, a British East India Company trader on Vancouver Island in 1786, wrote, quote, "I dreaded the sight of a woman, for whenever any were present, they were sure to preside over and direct all commercial transactions, and as often as that was the case, I was obliged to pay 3 times the price." There's often a false perception also of trade fraud by traders. With centuries of intertribal trade behind them, Native men and women drove hard bargains. When they were accused of cheating Indians, trader Joseph Rolette remarked, quote, "It is not so easy a thing to do as you might imagine. I've tried it these 20 years and have never succeeded." Another erroneous idea was shoddy goods. The traders requested quality. As an order by Fort Union notes, the supply of trade axes, quote, "are for the Indian women, and if they have any but good axes, only few robes are prepared." Oops, lost it. Where'd it go? Okay, here we are. The keyboard's a little touchy for my papers, sorry. Interaction. Okay, now it's not answering. Okay. It's not answering the keyboard. All right. Can somebody get Joe? Or is he around? I think maybe the battery's out on the clicker. It stopped, it stopped working.
Be right back.
Okay. And it's not answering to the keyboard.
Says they're full.
Is it? Okay. It's not, the slides aren't answering to the keyboard. Maybe if I do it this way. Do it manually?
I'll be right back.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay, I got it to answer to the keyboard at least. Okay. Technology is wonderful when it works. Okay. Interaction with the white traders altered gender dynamics by elevating men's trade in horses and weapons and making some women's roles secondary. And many of the tribes were matrilineal, which meant that the kinship ties were pivotal to peaceful relationships and good trade. Also necessary was to understand several tribal languages, and the women were already multilingual intermediaries. Also crucial were the severe imbalance of genders, since only men were permitted to work for the Hudson Bay Company and the American Fur Trade Company and travel to the interior. And because it was not seen as safe for civilized women, there were far more men than women beyond the Mississippi, and those available were native. So whether they were trappers or officers, all men sought companionship and entree into tribal communities. Marriage to a native woman provided both. Thank you. White traders came with many preconceptions of the drudge, the squaw image, but began to value these women in greater economic and social terms and their power to assert themselves. Francis Chardon, the factor at Fort Clark, wrote July 15th of 1835 how he had received a whipping from his wife, his Lakota wife, Chonsumanska, for his bad behavior at a ceremonial dance, where he admitted he had been in the wrong. So the companies initially forbid these intermarriages, but soon found that if an employee had the expense of a wife, he would take more wages in goods instead of cash. Now, these marriages required exceptional women, ambitious, adventurous, and brave, with status among their own people. They provided for their own families and their community, but they also influenced politics, economics, and technology. Now, some historians, myself included, view the relationships as totally responsible for the success of the fur trade. It could not have happened without. I had a conversation the other day with Professor Jim Scott from Dordt College, and he's very familiar with the fur trade. And he said that, of course, we know that Lewis and Clark would not have survived if it had not been for Sacagawea. She saved their lives more than once. Now, for example, in 1814, Manuel Lisa, out of St. Louis, already married to a woman by the name of Polly Chu of New Orleans, married Omaha Chief Big Elk's daughter, Mitane, and cemented an alliance tying the Omaha to U.S. interests during the war with Great Britain, the War of 1812, by providing a continual supply of furs to his trading post. Now, as described by Smithsonian anthropologist John Ewers, Sacagawea, those who followed, were full partners. They were half of an active diplomatic and economic team. Intermarriage with one or more tribes increased the number of predetermined loyalties for trade and for governance of an area. Now, how did these marriages take place? What were the expectations of both sides? Mariage à la façon du pays. That's French for marriage in the custom of the country. And that refers to what we would consider common law marriage in the European view. And there's a tendency to think these marriages were convenient, casual liaisons. However, promiscuity was not the norm in tribal society. The native wife's behavior followed distinct tribal social rules, and the companies also had theirs. Most were what trapper James Douglas saw in March of 1842 as making his, quote, tastes and character formed, softened as it is by many tender ties. Voyageurs, those independent trappers, early took on the fashion of the country. But the Hudson Bay Company forbid it for their employees at first. But they soon realized the economic pluses and the impossibility of preventing it, and the need to retain men who could withstand rigors of the interior. Those long, cold winters in the Rocky Mountains, when the fur was at its peak, is when they had to be out there. And so they changed policies to just require a man to provide for his family, so it would not be the company's responsibility. The explorer Samuel Hearne, with the Hudson Bay Company, in 1771 stated women should be on all of the trading teams, as, quote, one of them can carry or haul as much as two men, pitch our tents, make and mend our clothing, keep us warm at night, and in fact there is no such thing as traveling any considerable distance or for any length of time in this country without them. On June 29th of 1836, the naturalist and artist John Kirk Townsend wrote a summary of interaction with native wives. He says, "She is particularly useful to her husband. She can also kill and dress an elk, run down and shoot a buffalo, spear a salmon for her husband's breakfast, as well as any manservant he could employ. And added to all this, she has in several instances saved his life in skirmishes with Indians at the imminent risk of her own, so that he has some reason to be proud of her." Now, the men coming directly out of St. Louis or Europe rarely knew how to do many of the tasks required to survive, and so without such knowledge, they would have not lived through their first winter. Historian William Swaggerty ranks the nationality and the military or company rank of the men. He says that also had a bearing on the chosen wives. Canadian and American trappers in the Great Lakes preferred mixed blood Ojibwa and Cree wives, while the French and Spanish American trappers on the plains were more likely to have full blood wives. Owners and traders, only a third did. The early concentration of Shoshone, Lakota, Flathead, Arapaho, Nez Perce, and Blackfeet for first wives, and an increased number of Lakota as traders married into the Plains tribes as they moved further west. The Plains tribes, which signed treaties between 1850 and 1860, that gave greater status to men such as Jim Bridger, who had 3 marriages, to a Shoshone by the name of Mary Washaki, Flathead by the name of Cora Ensala, and an Arikara, Chipta, or a Ute, and James Bordeaux to an Arikara and a Lakota. Both later would become official agents for the U.S. government due to the connections they had with those tribes. The frequency of breaking company rules show there was also an increasing interdependence between traders and the Indians, and the inexperience of early company employees meant greater reliance on the women to provide daily needs. Now, what about these marriages? Well, obtaining a wife was not a grab-and-run affair. Marriages were performed according to the woman's culture. The first step was to obtain the consent of her parents, who usually took the woman's interests in mind, and were paid a bride price, most commonly a string of horses and an amount of dry goods. And that was not to buy her. That was to replace the loss of her valuable labor, because again, it was the women in the villages who took care of all of the food, who took care of all of the hides, who owned everything. They owned the teepee. They owned all of the cooking utensils. They owned everything in that encampment. A man owned his horse, his weapons, and his ceremonial objects. That's all he owned. And that continued until the 1960s among the Omaha, and among the Navajo in particular. So you get the permission of the parents, the girl is willing, and that was in a, it was also with the understanding that they could separate at any time. She was not a piece of property, not to her parents and not to her new husband. She was valued. And this was in strong contrast to Anglo culture, in which legal marriages were made for life, usually by clergy. And this led to some confusion as to the status of a mariage de façon paix. Few were seen as legally married in the eyes of the government. Swaggerty's statistics also showed that most trappers only took one wife, the marriages lasting an average of 15 years. And additional marriages were mainly due to the death of one or more, either of the spouses. And out of 312 cases, 58% never married again. There were exceptions. Toussaint Charbonneau, Lewis and Clark's guide, Sakawe's former husband, in 1843, at 80 years old, took bride number 5 at Fort Clark. It was a young Assiniboine woman. James Beckworth, the freed son of a Virginia planter, eventually had 6 wives. Now, sadly, there were always a few who only saw their mates as sexual partners and free labor, but the majority seemed to be long and dedicated relationships. The concept of native promiscuity is misunderstood. Sexual experimentation was commonly tolerated among unmarried adults, but infidelity in marriage was a serious offense and unnecessary because there were many ways to easily separate or divorce. In many tribes, infidelity was severely punished by cutting off the tip of a wife's nose. Now, for trappers, children were a disadvantage due to the rigors of the nomadic life. So there was a marked difference in birth rates between trappers' wives and traders' wives. Usually, Native women had 1 child every 3 to 4 years, and it's often attributed to breastfeeding, with maybe 4 children in her childbearing years of ages 18 to 30. And a semi-nomadic life discouraged having many small children at one time. The general rule was only 2 under the age of 10, because in case of danger, she could carry one while her spouse or an older child could carry another. However, a trader's wife might have 7 or more children by the time she was 30, because she was living a more settled lifestyle with better health overall. However, infant mortality stayed about the same for both. Now, living within the forts as a trader's wife had some downsides. Traditionally, as I said, the women owned all the property, controlled all the trade, and they owned everything, including the children, independent of their spouses. In anthropology, we call that mama's baby, daddy's maybe. And trapper wives, being of various tribes and customs, confined to housing areas owned by the company, not them, often did not get along. In 1814, there's one incident. The Iroquois wife of Ignace Silohi squabbled with Duncan McDougall's wife, who was a Chinook, over disciplining the Iroquois' children. So the Iroquois slapped the Chinook, and, quote, a dreadful row ensued and several women ended up in the bay. So there was an all-out cat fight. Silohe's family was then sent to live outside the fort, and peace resumed. Now, those dissatisfied with their husbands, as I said, had ways of leaving, and many of them often just up and left, went back to their families, to their kin. And reluctance of the spouse to pursue them came from being entirely under the power of the Indians. They were obliged to submit to their wife taking off to be able to keep their hand in the business, because they had to not only survive out there, but be able to trade. And so polygamy was culturally acceptable. Usually the wives were already related as sisters or cousins and got on well. And that was important because it eased the labor burdens and the isolation of being the husband being away for long periods of time. A few men had families in St. Louis as well as at the trading post. And while accepted, that was limited to those who could afford supporting 2 such widely separated households. All the wives faced cross-cultural stresses. They had to learn new languages, new cultural norms, often adapt to unfamiliar living conditions. They were separated from family In a majority male population, that meant loss of support of other women to share tasks in child rearing, even birthing without a midwife. They were at risk of sexual exploitation, domestic violence, abandonment far from home. And of course, close quarters with Europeans at the forts exposed them to infectious disease, often making them the carriers to other tribes. In 1837, smallpox immensely altered the dynamics of the upper Missouri, leaving the Hidatsa with 700 dead out of a population of 1,000. Over 6,000 northern Blackfoot and Piegan. Several tribes were decimated and their social structures in shreds after a number of trade gatherings, the rendezvous. While realizing the traders had brought the disease, there was not enough manpower left to drive them away. And by that time, all of them had become so dependent on the firearms and the other goods that their fates were now tied to the traders completely. Now, as an aside, one damning failure of the trading companies was that an effective vaccine for smallpox had been available in the East since 1802. Congress had authorized Secretary of War Lewis Cass to hire doctors to inoculate the tribes within the trading areas, and he declined to implement it. Let's take a look at a few of these remarkable traders and trappers' wives. Wamde Anapatewa, Eagle Woman. She was born in 1820 to Two Kettles Band near Pierre, South Dakota, and she married Honoré Picot, general agent for the Choteau Company, who also had a white family in St. Louis. So Wamde and Honoré had 2 daughters. The marriage lasted 10 years. Picot returns to St. Louis to his other family and has decided to leave the trade. So Wamde remarried to the new agent, Charles Galpin, in 1850. Speaking Lakota and several other languages, as well as English and French, she became the go-between for the Army and the bands of the Dakota during the 1862 Minnesota uprising called Little Crow's War. She traveled with her husband and Father Pierre de Smet to the Powder River to meet with the hostile Lakota. De Smet described Wamde as exercising great influence due to being related to several of the war chiefs. She helped convince Sitting Bull and Gall to come into Fort Rice for peace talks with General Alfred Sully in 1866. Galpin died in 1869, and she continued to run the post as its agent. Later, she moved it to the Standing Rock Reservation. The corrupt Secretary of War, William Belknap, tried a hostile takeover of her business, but the agent, Edmund Palmer, reported back to Washington that she declines to obey on the grounds that she's an Indian and entitled to trade with her own people. She manages her business herself and is quite competent to do so. Even Lieutenant Colonel George Custer refused to oust her from the business, and she continued to run her post through the war years until her death in 1888, and she is buried at Fort Yates. Christina MacDonald Mackenzie Williams, a Métis daughter of Chief Angus MacDonald, Scottish trader, and Catherine Baptiste and Nez Perce. Her father trained her in the business, and she acted as his hostess and translator. In 1870, she married a James Mackenzie, who became the chief trader of Kamloops Post in Victoria, Alberta, Canada. When he died, she, with 2 of their children, took charge of the independently run post and faced fierce competition from the Hudson Bay Company. After one particularly difficult winter, white traders bought up all the pack animals, hoping to squeeze her out of business. Undaunted, she sent word for native men to help transport her supplies, and that group made it back to her before the others, which allowed her to sell her inventory for a higher profit. And as William said, I more than held my own with them. And she later remarried, but continued to control her own ranch and her own business. Narawista, daughter of 2 sons, a chief of the Blackfoot Confederacy, was born in 1825 in Canada and moved to Fort Union, where she married Albert Culbertson. He was chief trader for the American Fur Company. She was well known as a hostess in the European style. In some of the mentions of her, they talk about the lace doilies and antimacassars in her drawing room. And she was an interpreter and a diplomat for over 30 years. In 1858, the Culbertsons moved to a farm near Peoria, Illinois, where she lived what was considered an unconventional life for Illinois. She raised a teepee on the lawn and dressed in traditional clothing for several weeks at a time, usually during the summer. You can imagine, if you've been in Peoria, that being something you'd see in your neighborhood. After they moved the trade to Fort Benton, Montana, she left to visit family in Alberta and never returned. Madeleine Marcotte de Frambois, an Odawa of the St. Joseph River Valley of what became Indiana. She married Joseph de la Frambois in 1804. Now, Joseph was killed in 1856, and she established herself as an independent trader with her 2 children, 2 Indian slaves, and 12 voyageurs who had worked for her husband and decided to stay on with her. John Jacob Astor supplied her with goods, and she remained successful even after the American Fur Company had eliminated any other independent traders. She shipped hundreds of packs each summer to Mackinac, eventually retired and built a residence there, open to all visitors, and she sponsored incoming traders. Alex de Tocqueville visited her and mentioned her in his writings about his trip across America. She opened a school to train Native women as teachers and rented part of her house to Protestant missionaries, while requiring that both full and mixed blood Native children and any destitute white children in the community be admitted to the school free of charge. She was a convert to Catholicism and donated the property next door to her home and provided much of the funding to build St. Anne's Church. Both the house and the church are still standing. The house is now Harbor View Inn, and she is buried under the altar at St. Anne's. Now, racist sentiments carried from the East, and that meant that the more white blood in a mixed wife became more valued. And though traders reviewed, they felt that these remote posts were too rough to appeal to white women, some did begin to arrive as settlement increased. Familiar institutions such as schools, churches, private businesses were established around the forts. And once the sense that the West had been settled enough to attract white women, more rigid racial lines were drawn. Women, often tagged as the first white woman in an area, were celebrated as brave adventurers. Yet reality was they were in a very precarious position where Native women were fully at home. Some would travel with their husbands to rendezvous to set up camp and cook, but they were the exception. The usual, the majority, stayed at the post waiting for the husband's return. Very few white wives came with the traders, and even fewer followed trapper husbands. The first in Western Canada was Marie Anne Gabori in 1806, the first white woman to give birth in the Northwest. She lived among the natives with her voyageur husband and adopted many of their customs, She carried her infant on her back, she wore moccasins and lived in a teepee. And at the posts, wives of officers were seen as first ladies, entertaining important visitors, helping with bookkeeping, and sometimes running the store or an infant school. But very few married so well. Many were soon widowed. They were married to men on distant assignments or to low-level laborers, and had to work hard to compensate the company for their rations or to fulfill the terms of their absent husband's contract. Or they were employed. If their husband had disappeared and abandoned them, they would be employed by the company in what was called country produce. That was candle making, oiling cloth, cleaning and salting fish, as a washerwoman, a seamstress, a cook. Because if the man skipped out on his contract and she was at the fort, she had to fulfill what would have been owed to him, by him to the company. One of these women was Elizabeth Beeman from Washington, D.C. Her husband was supervisor of the Aleut trade in Alaska in 1879. Beeman was unusual in having been trained by her father as a cartographer, and she found occupation lettering the ever-changing maps of the newly acquired U.S. territory of Alaska. But those racial lines were drawn, and she separated herself from the Aleut women by always wearing the highest fashion of the East to distinguish her rank. Others of the few white women that followed in their footsteps were missionaries, such as Narcissa Whitman and Eliza Spalding, who attended the 1836 rendezvous, accompanying their minister husbands, and they were the first white married women over the Rockies. The first white single woman over the Rockies was Anna Maria Pittman, who was a Methodist missionary. According to the Journal of the Presbyterian Historical Society, the American Fur Company in St. Louis and the Hudson Bay Company in Montreal provided the initial protection and supply chain for those 16 mountain fairs, what we call rendezvous, held over the 2 years, 1836-1838, and 200 wagons, just under 1,000 people, went through South Pass in 1843. And South Pass had been discovered by John C. Fremont and some of the others of those first mountain men. In 1838, some others came through the area: Mary Gray, Mary Walker, Myra Ailes, and Sarah Smith, first women through South Pass. Now, they all kept journals, and they were valuable observers, and so much of what we know of those early years come from their writings. But social occasions such as picnics and dances and church socials became more common. And with these white families, then also came Protestant Christian morals, racial hierarchies, and Native wives faced even greater prejudice. Catholic priests, such as Jesuits Father Blanchette and Demars, were assigned to Fort Vancouver, and they were more inclined to be lenient in attitude and were welcome among nearly all of the tribes. They didn't fully recognize the custom of marriage of the country, but they often then provided a natural marriage rite that ratified the consent of the partners and legitimizing the children. Sharp contrast was the way the Protestants handled it. Protestant clergy were against the custom completely. Reverend Herbert Beaver, and I could not find a photograph of this man, not in the records of the church or anywhere. He was not well liked, and I guess that's why I can't find a picture of him. But in 1836, He was noted to be bigoted and contemptuous of those of his congregation who were native, and he flatly refused to credit these marriages. This outraged the chief factor, John McLaughlin, a dour Scot. However, he had a mixed-blood wife of 25 years named Marguerite, who was known as a respectable First Lady. But Reverend Beaver referred to her as McLaughlin's kept woman, who should not be allowed to associate with my own wife or other properly married women. Now, Reverend Beaver demanded that McLaughlin and all the American Fur Company men submit to the Church of England and the rights of the church. And be remarried. McLaughlin, a devout Catholic, was so irate that he beat the minister with his cane, and he had Beaver relieved of his post in 1838. In 1862, a Shoshone teenager, Abwani Tukanka Stewart, a Shoshone, married a Montana pioneer gold seeker, businessman, politician, and rancher Granville Stewart. Now, we have records of what it was like to live on the ranch with this husband and wife from a man by the name of Teddy Blue Abbott, who had worked on the Stewart Ranch and later married their second daughter. She says she kept to herself when strangers were around, but she was a power in that family. Nothing happened without her word. But Stewart's change of heart toward Abwani, his wife of 26 years, the mother of 9 of his 11 children, illustrates the racial quicksands. Abwani died in 1888, and Stewart prepared a funeral card that read, quote, "Noble, devoted, self-sacrificing wife, gentle, loving mother, farewell." Still, within a year, Stewart had remarried a white woman and began formally excluding all 9 of his mixed-blood children from his life, and they never inherited or had any say. She's buried in Montana at Fort McGinnis, and there's a picture of her headstone kind of buried under the weeds. Any attempt by these country wives to mingle socially was seen as impertinent by the white women, and that was supported by the missionaries, and so they were often snubbed. We must remember, though, that this was a reflection of the ingrained social patterns and prejudices of the times. It would have been exceptional for any woman from the East or the South to freely mingle with women of any other race. Now, even those such as James Douglas and his wife Amelia, who had been married formally by that same Reverend Beaver, and wrote, though very respectable women in their way, they were not raised by the mere act of legal marriage to the same moral and social level as married females of full European blood. As long as Amelia remained in the close-knit society of the Hudson Bay Company, she was included because of the high rank of her husband. But when he was made governor of British Columbia, she knew the full ugliness of snobbery, snubs, and gossip. Even when he was knighted and became Sir James Douglas, and she became Lady Douglas, she was ignored and no invitations were given. Now, probably the greatest worry for the native wives was fear of desertion and the unsure future of their children. Mixed daughters of French officers were often sent east for finishing school. We're very familiar with the story of Susan LaFlèche and her sisters and her brother, all sent east for schooling. And such as St. Anne's Academy in Quebec, for those in Canada as early as the 1850s, which was decades prior to any American boarding schools, such as Carlisle or Chimois. Even there, they were on the edge of society. Most often, they received whatever education was available closer to home in dame schools, or what were called infant schools. Educated mixed French and Canadian girls, if they had a higher degree of white blood, they integrated a little more easily. However, their Indian heritage had to be hidden by their new families and by generations of descendants. In his journals, Ross Cox noted, quote, "The half-breed women are excellent wives and mothers, and instances of improper conduct are rare. Marriages to officers contribute to the cohesiveness of the company." Well, what about for the sons? It was a very mixed story, as both race and gender worked against them. Because without that label of the gentler sex, they were suspect of divided loyalties and potential violent or criminal tendencies. Pacific Fur Company trader, an Irishman, Ross Cox, noted several by name that he described as rascals involved in petty theft of guns and ammunition to hunt when they were not gainfully used by their fathers as interpreters. Most followed their fathers into being interpreters or other trade-related work. Some were sent to the nearest city or back east, particularly if their fathers remarried a European woman. But in all cases, the children had to fit into whatever the ethnic, national, and gender roles of the dominant group in the area in which they lived. Late 19th century immigrants were typically Midwesterners, Protestants, and fully devoted to rural American ideals of piety, patriotism, and clear gender roles. The concept of manifest destiny separated newcomers from earlier groups, and these newcomers brought the ideas of the new biology, a rigid fixity of races arranged in a hierarchy. So the terms half-breed, squaw, and buck become popular pejoratives. Full-bloods now being romanticized as pure, while the term mongrelized appears in many letters, diaries, and reports. When you look at the time period, Darwinism, Victorian scientific concepts also made Native Americans difficult to classify. Walt Whitman wrote in 1849 a novella titled The Half-Breed, in which the mixed main character was a monstrous abortion, whereas the full-blood was unblemished, stoic, and courageous. Now, intermarriage between those of more than half Indian blood was termed miscegenation and was against the law. It was banned by the Washington Territory legislation until the 1950s. On the other hand, the Dawes Act of 1880 had encouraged mixed individuals to identify as Native for land purposes, even if less than half. So you have a very strange out of balance there with the views. We found at this time that in the East, Native people are romanticized, and there are groups that form themselves friends of the Indians and so forth, but people who were living in this area from Iowa on west were the ones that were anti-Indian because they were coming onto stolen land. And so the idea that the Indians were less than was the one that carried through, whereas in the East, where there were very few Indians left, they could romanticize them. Now, the majority of white Americans coming west in the 1850s condemned mixed relationships, still not to the same level as were black and white marriages. It was mainly because of the economic and expansion advantages in the West, but social acceptance was minimal. To many, mixed-blood children inherited the worst traits from each parent. Supposed laziness of their lower-class trapper fathers and superstitions of their native mothers. So we see this shift by the 1880s and 1890s in how it's viewed. A true yet odd case was McConaughey, a white woman who had been born Frances Slocum. She was abducted from a Pennsylvania farm in 1747 and raised by the Delaware. She married a Miami warrior and in 1813 was living in a very prosperous village where the artist George Winter painted these portraits of her. She spoke no English. Remember, she had been taken when she was just about 5 years old. She spoke no English. She lived where the entire village she lived in did not speak English. They were not Christians. They practiced all the customs of the Miami. But somebody realized who she was, and so some of her Pennsylvania Slocum relatives came, and they transformed her back into the lost sister, Frances Slocum. The material prosperity of the village was attributed to her being white, even though she had never spoken English. Were not Christians and practiced all the customs of the Miami. So this was kind of a reverse thing. So this was the viewpoints from the east coming further west. Now as settlement grew, mixed marriages became rarer and rarer and unacceptable to social approval. Now incoming settlers might show charitable concern for native welfare overall, but were appalled at any specific intermingling. Now many preferred to move even further into the interior. Former trappers and traders like Tim Goodale and Jenny, his Shoshone wife, they lived on Boulder Creek, Colorado, until the Colorado mining boom hit, and they retreated into the Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho to live in isolation. Christopher Kit Carson, the archetypical mountain man, became the agent for the Ute Agency in 1856 in Rayado, New Mexico, because the coming of the railroad was ending the fur trade. As some successfully combined native and white lifestyle, made possible by adaptation. John Jack Robertson and his wife Margaret, who was a Shoshone, they had invested wisely with William Sublette, and then they became independent traders. And as by then control was lessening for the tribes, and the buffalo were gone, and so were the beaver, the wolves, the bear, overhunting and other factors. So Margaret had her own business. She ran a hotel called the St. Charles Hotel on the Green River, and they created a settlement of retired trapper families and amassed a large estate. And any retired trappers or traders and their mixed blood family were welcome. Sometimes native wives did return east with their husbands. In 1851, Charles Lapenture from Fort Union took his second Assiniboine wife, Mixcloud, to a farm in Little Sioux, Harrison County, Iowa. She was killed while picking berries in 1853 by a passing band of Omaha men who saw her as an enemy Lakota. However, many were left behind where the trapping and trading had been done. Maybe they married another active trader or simply made their way back to their own people. There were also those perceived as white by later history, even though they had been Indian. Here in Sioux City along Perry Creek, you can visit the first bride's grave, resting place of Rosalie Menard. Came to the area with her Canadian trader father and her native mother. She married a mixed blood trader named Joseph Lenes. The relationship was solemnized in 1853 by a Catholic priest. They had a small farm near what is now 2nd and Water Streets along the Floyd River. She died in 1865, but her experience took on a highly romanticized version. A monument erected in 1938 states that she was the first white bride in Sioux City. completely ignoring her native heritage, and that Catholic priests in the area had been marrying people in the area long before 1853. So without fame or salaries, women were pivotal from the very beginning for the trade's success. They left a lasting legacy of kinship ties, economics, clothing styles, medicinal knowledge, and survival skills. And partly because they lived in a sparsely populated area, their stories were left out of the pioneer narratives. Ironically, they remain either among the most morally vilified or highly romanticized in historical literature. As the old fur trade order gradually gave way to agrarian settlement, it brought indigenous customs into disrepute. By 1850, there had been more than 7 generations of the fur trade. The traditions created were not without prejudices, but had been more bicultural than those compared to the later miners, railroad workers, homesteaders, town builders, and ranchers had been, or would be. The former close partnerships between Indian and white were extinct by the 1870s. White values and prejudices gained ground and lessened acceptance for integration, becoming, as trader and journalist James Hargraves stated, it was a world we have lost, and regretfully it could have been an enriching human experience. Thank you.